Hey everyone, this is Grandmaster Finegold here with the Chess.com video of the day. I'll start be doing this many times, hopefully at least once a week, once we have strong Grandmaster games to show you throughout the year. The first game for me is going to be Aydin Suleymanli. Sorry for mispronouncing your name. He's from Azerbaijan. Versus Ilia Smirin. That name I got right. This game was played in the Aeroflot Open, which is a very strong tournament in Russia they have every year. They usually get between 50 and 100 Grandmasters. And even though Aydin is only 14 years old, he won the tournament, and he's not even a GM yet. He's the current reigning World Under 14 champion. Let's have a look. Now, Smirin, even though he's older than me, if that's possible, I'm not even sure if it's possible, Smirin's in his 50s just like me. I'm 50. I think Smirin's 51, but I didn't look it up before the game, so who knows? He's definitely older than me, even if he's not. He was a terror in U.S.-Swiss tournaments in the 90s and 2000, and Smirin's USCF rating got up over 2850. And unlike me, as I became older, I'm playing more boring now. Smirin likes to mix it up, and unfortunately, when you mix it up, sometimes you get mixed up, and he's playing a 14-year-old, so that might not be the right strategy. Now, Smirin likes to play the King's Indian, so I'm slightly confused why he played d6. Obviously, he can still play the King's Indian, but he's playing a slightly unusual move order. And here, White has a lot of moves. Most common are knight f3 and knight c3. And he played the passive move e3. And I think the idea is to get the opponent out of his preparation. I'm sure if White had played knight c3 or knight f3, Black would just be blitzing out the moves. E3 is not a very common move, and normally the younger player is playing tons and tons of theory, but here Ilia is playing a slightly unusual line that he knows, and he hopes his younger opponent with less experience doesn't know. So they get sort of a very positional kind of King's Indian where White also fianchettoed his bishop. So we'll see what happens here. He's playing King's Indian structure, and White decides to do the same thing. White doesn't have to fianchetto his bishop. He can put his bishop on e2 and castle, but this is fine. And instead of going for a normal kind of King's Indian with knight gf6, Smirin plays a little bit differently. Since he didn't play knight f6 on move 1, which you would normally play in the King's Indian, he still has f5 available. And normally in the King's Indian, when you're Black and you want to play f5, you have to move your knight off of f6 to either h5 or e8 or somewhere. But he hasn't played knight f6 yet, so Smirin decides to go for knight e7. This way he can play f5 as soon as he wants and not have it blocked. And if he wants a knight on f6, he could play knight f6 later, which is funny because in a lot of King's Indians, Black plays knight c6, knight e7, and then he could play knight f6, knight d7, and here we're switching the knights. Instead of each knight making two moves, they're making one move. So Smirin's trying to take advantage of the move order by delaying knight f6. Okay? And he goes for it right away, f5. So here we have a King's Indian type of position that you would assume is advantageous for Black because he got an f5 in one move and didn't have to move his knight off of f6 in the way. Okay? So far so good. And White decided to trade on e5. Black could also take with a minor piece, but he took with a pawn. And then, slightly surprising to me, played e4. I mean, he didn't play e4 in one move, he played it in two moves. So you would think Black is doing fine here, although the engine still likes White. And there's a reason for that. If you're a King's Indian player at home, or you play against the King's Indian, you're going to run into the computer hating you. Okay? The computers don't like the King's Indian. Now, a lot of Grandmasters will play it because you get these tricky positions. Right? And if you don't want to draw all your games with Black, you want to win some of them, you get a tricky position. Now, I didn't say this before the lecture, so I didn't want to scare you, but this guy has the same rating as me. Aydin, well, not anymore, not after Aeroflot. But before this tournament, he was rated 2474 FIDE. He probably gained about 50 points. And he's an IM, so obviously his older, more experienced Grandmaster opponent wants to beat him with the Black pieces. So he's playing a very sharp line. Okay, he plays c6, which is common in these positions, to control d5. This is one of the advantages Black has in this structure is white can't play c3 because white played c4 very early. So black can try to get a knight to d4 and white can't get a knight to d5. Okay, so that's well, white just played knight d5. He didn't really play it. That was what we call a mouse slip. Okay, now the next few moves revolve around something very interesting. Black wants to play f4, and obviously f3 later, which would keep these pieces blocked. I can't move these pieces because my e-pawn's in the way. Then black can start his attack. And white is like, no, you're not going to play f4. I'm controlling f4. You can't play f4. So he plays bishop e3 because he controls f4. And black says, all right, I'll play queen c7. Now I can control f4, so now I can play f4. And white says, no, queen d2, you can't play f4. I'm controlling f4 more than you. Okay, now here starts the downfall of black's position. And the moves aren't bad, but the idea just didn't work out. Black decided he found a very tricky way to play f4, and he did. And unfortunately, it doesn't give him an advantage. The engine just says play knight f6, just like a normal King's Indian, and it's an equal position. Okay? If the engine says black is equal in a King's Indian, black's doing pretty well, because engines, as I said, don't like the King's Indian for black. But instead, Smirin did something very tricky, which is why I trade all the pieces and I play very boring when I'm playing a little kid, because they're trickier than me. I might be older than them and more experienced, but they're trickier. And that's not the way Smirin plays. Smirin doesn't play like me. Smirin plays tricky. And Smirin played knight b6. And the King's Indian don't play knight b6. That's not a good square for the knight. And he did it because he sees a tactical trick. He attacks the pawn, and even if the pawn wasn't there, he wants to play knight c4. And the obvious move b3, which basically kills this knight. This knight can't go anywhere. And white's going to get a tempo with c5. And the reason he played knight b6 was after b3, he's opening this diagonal, and the knight on c3 isn't defended as well, so now he has f4. That was why he played knight b6. Because if he played f4 before, he'd just lose a pawn. Now when white wins a pawn, which he did, Smirin plays the very tricky bishop takes c3, and the queen is overworked. The queen's defending the knight, and the queen's defending the knight that was on c3. How did this all start? It all started because Smirin attacked this pawn, and white played b3 defending it, which undefended the knight on c3. This was Smirin's big plan. The problem with Smirin's big plan is he's getting rid of the bishop on g7, which defends his king. That's a great bishop. So black's going to win a little material, but his king's going to get exposed. And that's what happened. And here, white could play the obvious bishop takes rook. Black would have two knights for a rook and a pawn, but black's position would be really nice. And white doesn't want to trade his dark squared bishop. White wants to attack with his dark squared bishop. Because black doesn't have a dark squared bishop, white's winning on the dark squares. So he actually decided not to take the exchange, and instead he played the computer recommended rook d1. Morphy approved. The rook on a1, not too good. Rook on d1, that's better. Okay, and he says, you're up a piece, but I got this diagonal, I got this diagonal, your rook's attacked, I got this diagonal, I got the two bishops, I have a passed pawn, and these pieces don't make any sense. So white has excellent compensation for a piece. Excellent. Not to mention he has a pawn. Okay, and the engine actually says black has to be very careful here or he'll be losing soon. And it's very hard, very difficult to play black when your opponent's attacking you and the engine says this is the only move, this is the only move. That's when it's real easy to fall apart. Play bishop e6. This is probably the losing move. The engine wants to play knight d7, getting the knight back into the game. That way we control e5 and f6 and f8, get our knight to a good square. Obviously the knight on b6 is not on a good square. But Smirin's like, develop my bishop, develop my rook, that's gotta be good. c5 attacking the knight. And black's in a lot of trouble here because my rook's coming to d6, attacking this bishop, and getting rid of the coordination of the queen and the rook. So for example, if I play knight d7, rook d6, I'm threatening this, and I'm threatening this, and the engine says black loses. It says it's over. So Smirin, being a tricky guy that he is, didn't play knight d7, played rook h4 threatening mate. Problem is, when you play knight b6 for tricks, and you play rook h4 for tricks, Smirin didn't realize tricks are for kids. So he's threatening mate, but once the one-move threats are stopped, why is the knight on b6? Why is the rook on h4? It's not the play of an experienced grandmaster. Okay, so Smirin in this game was playing very tricky, hoping to beat his opponent, less experienced opponent, but he's 14 years old. He's a great tactician. He's not going to fall for that. And here he plays the very nice rook d6. You can't play queen mate. And these pieces are all in a lot of trouble. And the engine says that already white is winning. The reason white is winning is that black has loose pieces. Okay, these pieces on e6 and h4 are not protected. So if it's white's move, white's going to play queen f6. And then that's it. And that's why you don't want your rook on h4. Okay, so he played knight d7. Obviously, that prevents queen f6. But that makes the position even more losing. The engine says the best move is knight c8. The reason is you can't take the bishop because of mate. You can't move the rook. And after knight c8, which is the engine's best move, it says queen f6 and bishop g5 give white a winning position, but barely winning. You know, +1, +2. And this is the main line of the engine. And you can see materials equal. White has control of the dark squares. White has the two bishops. So white has a close to winning advantage, if not winning. But it's not over now. The game's going to go a long time. Okay? But after the move knight d7, he didn't last very long. f4, excellent move. Because now there's no queen h2 mate. So now I am threatening the bishop. And the rook is just trapped here. That's not a good place for the rook. And now the engine's giving some crazy numbers. You know, +4, +6, +8. Because black's position is falling apart. His king's exposed. His bishop's attacked. His rook is trapped. His knights have nowhere to go. All those squares are protected. And white has the two bishops and an extra pawn. So the game ended pretty quickly. Bishop h3, the bishop was attacked. Queen c4 check. He trades and then plays this fork queen e6. When all your pieces are undefended, they get forked. The rook is obviously undefended, and the knight was already attacked. So this is a winning fork. We attack the rook, and we're threatening rook takes d7. By the way, rook takes d7 is pretty scary. That threatens the queen and the e7 knight. Okay, so this is over. Rook takes, and there's no way to stop queen takes check and rook takes queen, so he gave his queen away. Now, some of you may be wondering, wait a minute, I have an idea. I'll play rook takes e4. Then if he takes the queen, I take his queen. If he takes the rook, I take his rook. It's a good idea, but it fails to a Zwischenzug. Those Germans have a word for everything. Queen f6 check. And then you're going to lose your queen. So that doesn't work. So he has to play queen takes rook, and he did. And now he has a rook and a knight for a queen, but this rook is no good. This pawn's weak. This pawn's hanging. This king is exposed. So it's just lost. White always repeated, so I'm not complaining, always repeat. Then played the correct f5. And you can't take the rook, because then white's going to have a queen for a rook. White's going to win this rook. So you can't take the rook on f5. And black's king is just way too exposed. And even if it wasn't, this pawn's indefensible, and black's down a queen for a rook and a piece. But obviously the white king is, the black king, I should say, not good. b5, saving the b pawn. Queen d6 check. It's checkmate time. Okay. If you play rook e6, the engine actually announces mate, but this is obviously just completely winning. You have to play king e5, rook e3 check, and okay. Obviously, if king here, your knight's hanging with check, and if you play king here, your rook's hanging. So, all right. So he didn't play rook e6. He played king f7. White played the excellent queen h6, threatening queen takes h7 check, winning the rook. Black king just has no defense. And here he resigned. If you play rook h8 to defend your pawn, queen g7 check wins your rook. So you can't defend h7. So now it's time to resign because you're getting mated, you're down a queen, and white's going to have a passed h-pawn. So it was funny, Smirin never moved his rook off of a8. So Smirin did what he wanted to do. He got a double-edged position, and he thought, I'm better than my opponent. The game's really tricky. That's the kind of chess I like. That's how you win with the black pieces. And didn't work out. His opponent played the tactics better than he did. His opponent had a safer king, and the tricks that Smirin played didn't work. So an excellent game from Suleymanli from Azerbaijan. By winning the Aeroflot Open today, he gets an invitation to Dortmund. Dortmund is a very strong round robin. They play in Germany in the summer. The average rating is about 2670 FIDE, maybe higher, and he's 2470 FIDE. So let's see if the young upstart can play GMs every round, just like in Dortmund, and Aeroflot, I should say, and beat them too. So that's going to be a really interesting summer for this strong young man. Well, that was the game of the day. Suleymanli beat Smirin and won the Aeroflot Open. Congratulations to the 14-year-old. And I hope you like this video. And this is the Chess.com game of the day. I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold. Click on the next video to watch more videos, game of the day from Chess.com. Bye, everyone.